Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Tips to Create a Strong Service Culture. I'm Ronnie Musselwhite, Director of Content and Education for the National Golf Course Owners Association, and on behalf of the entire NGCOA, thank you for your participation. Today's event will last approximately 45 minutes and is being recorded. We will provide access to this recording and all presentation slides soon after the webinar. We will also post this webinar on our NGCOA members-only networking site, Accelerate. Now, you know, it's no secret that one of the keys to success in the golf business is the customer experience. And the cornerstone of the customer experience is the culture of service that you create at your facility. Today, we'll highlight 5 tips to transform your team into providers of the culture of excellence that's unique to your operation. This is actually the first in a series of 4 hospitality webinars we'll be hosting over the next few weeks that focus on creating an environment that's customer-centric and wholly committed to delivering the best guest experience possible. Now I'd like to introduce Whitney Reed-Pinnell, who will present today's webinar. Whitney is owner and president of the award-winning consulting firm RCS Hospitality Group. With more than 30 years of experience in the industry, she is recognized as an expert in club management with a sharp focus on operations. Prior to founding RCS, Whitney held several top management positions with companies such as Marriott Management Services, the Desert Mountain Club, and Troon Golf. Since founding RCS in 2000, Whitney and her team have worked with hundreds of clubs of various types and sizes, assisting them with everything from budget and service troubleshooting, new club openings and remodels, to the rollout of strategic plans and the development of training programs for lasting improvement. We're certainly excited to have Whitney with us today and look forward to the insights she has to share. Now, if during today's session you have a question, please type it into the message box located at the bottom left-hand side of your computer screen. To submit your message, simply press Enter. Whitney will field the questions and answer them as time permits. And with that, I'll turn things over to Whitney. Whitney?
Thank you, Ronnie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today to talk about service culture. Today we're going to talk about what culture is, how to identify what your current culture is, how to determine what you want it to be, and then review the 5 critical steps that will move you toward that desired culture. If you think about company culture, it's important because it can make or break your club or your company. One of the most important things that managers do is manage their culture. And I'll tell you, if you're not managing it, it's managing you, and you may not even be aware to the extent that this is happening. If you think about culture and you think about a few different companies, say if you get on a Southwest flight to anywhere, you buy shoes at Zappos.com, anything from Nordstrom, home goods, books, or even groceries from Amazon, anything from Costco, or get a Starbucks latte, you'll get a flavor for their vibrant culture. This is the kind of service culture that we're going to talk about today and over the next few weeks. So when you think about culture, what does it mean exactly? So I have up here on the screen a few things to help you, but culture is a balanced blend of human psychology, employee attitudes, customer attitudes, actions, and beliefs that combined together create either pleasure or pain, serious momentum, or miserable stagnation. So you've probably been in places where you feel a really great culture and also places where the culture is very negative. A strong culture flourishes with a set of clear values and norms which actively guide the way a company operates, and it provides a framework in which people communicate. Employees are actively and passionately engaged in the business if they're operating from a sense of confidence and empowerment rather than navigating their days through extensive procedures and red tape, which can hamper performance. This is the culture that I want to share with you today. So if you think about it, a performance-oriented culture realizes better financial growth because of high employee involvement, strong internal communication, and an acceptance of healthy level of risk-taking in order to achieve new levels of continuous improvement. In short, your culture is your competitive advantage, it's the embodiment of your strategy, and it's what makes your logo meaningful and your brand dynamic. I love this quote from Airbnb about culture. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I do want to just highlight something on here, because this, to me, is really how culture is felt and seen in any club or any company. And I love these couple of lines. Culture is 1,000 things 1,000 times. It's living the core values when you hire, when you write an email, when you're working on a project, and when you're walking in the hall. So when you think about this and you think about your culture, it's basically the daily habits. It's the daily habits and how you do things. So I want you to think for a minute before I go into those 5 steps. Just think about your culture. A lot of people always say, well, I don't know what my culture is. How do I know what my culture is? Here's some tips. So if you think about your employees, ask yourself these questions. How do your employees look? How do they act? What words do they use? Who are you hiring? What does your management team look like? And then if you think about members, guests, or customers, depending on your club, if you're listening to their feedback, either through surveys, comment cards, feedback coming in through your staff, the guests that they bring to the club, and any sort of referrals that your customers give, this will give you an idea of what they feel about your culture. And then the last one is listening to vendors that work with you and also in the community. Are they giving you good information? Are they giving you good feedback? What do they say about you out in the community? And now with the internet, that's been around a very long time actually, but if you're doing social media scans, and hopefully all of you are, you also know what people are saying about you on things such as Yelp, Twitter, maybe setting some Google alerts, looking at Facebook, even LinkedIn, or some golf-specific websites. But all of this information, if you take it together and you look at it in a 360-degree view, will give you an idea of what your culture is. Very often people are shocked when they look at this compared to what they think their culture is. So I would ask you to think about that. So if it's different than what you thought it was, or if it's different than what you want it to be, or if the answers that immediately come to mind are not in line with what you feel you want it to be, then this is the exact right webinar for you. So let's get right to those 5 tips. First of all, the living values. In that quote I had from Airbnb, it talked about living your values. And the values really come from your strategic plan, who you are, what you want to be, where you're headed, what your mission is. But if you don't know your values, you'll have a very tough time having a service culture in line with it, obviously. But when you think about culture, it should be the entire embodiment of your strategic plan. Every employee that someone comes into contact with, every piece of signage, everyone that answers the phone, every interaction with your website, with any piece of your golf course should communicate your brand, your strategy, and your service culture. Without this, it's basically like having a strategic plan. It's a really great one maybe that sits on the shelf, but I believe it has to align with operations. So part of this, if you think, take Southwest Airlines as an example, I used them earlier. They're known to be the pioneer of low-cost travel in the airline industry. They've had over 40 years of profitable operations. And if you look at their interlocking processes and procedures that align with their strategy, you start to understand their business model more. I studied Southwest Airlines, and I just want to share a little bit with you because this will help you understand what I mean about living your values and aligning your culture with your strategic plan. So for Southwest Airlines, as an example, one of their strategic goals is to keep ticket prices low and turn around flights fast. So when you think about their business model, they don't assign seats, they don't charge for carry-on luggage, they encourage people to check their bags by doing this, and it doesn't take extra time boarding because people just get on and they move to their seat and keep going. So this allows Southwest to turn around faster. The flight attendants are actually a large part, if not the cleaning crew, so they have a vested interest in keeping the plane clean in flight, making cleaning time on the ground faster. Southwest operates from smaller airports because they have lower ground times and less congestion, which keeps most of their flights on time. So I could go on and on about what they do and how they have put their living values into play within their operations. but you can see how their strategy has affected everything that they do. One of the things that they have as part of their hiring, which I'll get to in just a minute, but one of Southwest hiring mantras is to hire people with a servant's heart and a warrior spirit. So they've taken their living values straight into how they hire, which is the second piece of living values that I have here, and that is hiring right. I would ask you, whenever we're working with a club to upgrade strategy or a new facility, we ask them this question, so I'll pose it to you. If you were looking at every person that you hire, what 5 things would each of those people have in terms of values or character traits? So I would ask you to think about that, because that is the best way to keep your service culture in line. If you hire right from the very beginning, that's the easiest way to keep your service culture intact. And the next thing I would ask you, and I'm bouncing up back into aligning your culture, critical service points. The next webinar that we do, we're going to talk about creating a service blueprint, but I want to give you just a quick preview. If you think about the 5 to 10 critical service points at your club, what are they? And does everyone know how to handle those situations? So these are the questions to ask. What are your customer service standards? Do your people know how to do what you expect them to do? Have you physically shown them what to do? What's your staff training plan to ensure the standards are executed every day with every customer? And how do you measure your training effectiveness? And the last thing, how do your managers coach people who have gaps in their performance? So when you talk about a service blueprint, you know, as an example, the service blueprint basically says, okay, our critical standard is we're going to greet guests by name as soon as we know them, as soon as we find out their name. In order to do that, there's probably 5 to 10 different processes behind it, or systems and procedures that have to be in place. So when we talk about a service blueprint, it actually maps out what needs to happen in order for you to have that customer experience. The third part of living values is training. When you think about training and you think about hiring, if you hire right and you train frequently, this is a really great way to keep your service culture strong. A lot of people think that an orientation, a one-day orientation is training, or maybe 3 days of shadow scheduling where one employee shadows another employee is training, or maybe you even have a great 2-week program. But training is ongoing. There's no possible way we could anticipate everything that's going to happen that someone will need. We can try, but it's an everyday ongoing process, because we're in customer service, we're in hospitality, and you're dealing with different people and different personalities every day. So something's bound to come up that requires ongoing training. So when you think about training, I have just a few things to help you. People fall to their level of training, not your expectations or their expectations. So if they're unable to get to something you want them to do, I would go back to their training. How have they been trained to do it? Did they understand it? And I would remind you, as managers, it's your responsibility to be understood, not their responsibility to understand you. So I could have a whole different day talking about different demographic groups and how to engage with them and how they communicate, but it's really important that you understand who your audience is, how to connect with them, and how to train them. Very often we fall for the trap that talking is training, and it's actually not training unless someone is able to master something that comes from that training. A lot of times people are talking and they're nodding and they're saying, yes, I understand. And if you turn around and say, okay, now you do it, show me how to do it, they can't do it. So if you're training, they're actually able to grasp something and master it. And the best way to do that I found is through role playing and allow for practice and feedback. And also training should stretch participants slightly beyond their current skill or competency level. But I would caution you, you should stretch them just enough to build new skills and boost their confidence, but not so far that it will produce an unhealthy anxiety in them because they won't learn. I'll also remind you about the old adage about if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Certainly you have to have performance standards on everything that you do with training. And this, again, goes back to your service culture. If you set the standards, you communicate it, you train it, then you can measure it. And the last thing here is to make sure that you catch people doing something right. You know, very often as managers, we are taught to look for things to correct or to manage. And sometimes there's 100 different things right in front of us that are going really great, and we have to remember to celebrate that. So in your training, I would recommend to you that you keep it simple, you keep it fun, and you keep it focused. Like I said, I could talk to you days about training, but this is such a critical part of service culture. I really cannot overstate that. The next thing here is dynamic and engaged leadership. You as managers model behavior daily, whether you mean to or not. And what I mean by that is someone is always watching. And as managers, the way that you treat employees, the way that you treat your customers is exactly how you're modeling the behavior that you want from your employees. So if the employees are not doing something that you want them to do, you might want to take a look at your performance, your team's performance, and see where they might be picking up the idea that that behavior is acceptable. I always encourage managers to ask themselves the question, am I the kind of role model that I would want to follow? And very often we forget just how much people are watching every day. So when you think about this, without an active, dynamic, and engaged leadership team, the culture will basically fall flat. You can hire right, you can have your values, live your values, you can align things in operations, but if you don't have a dynamic and engaged leadership, leading people through the process and celebrating with them and teaching them every day, it really can't go anywhere. Okay, sorry, just looking at my notes here. Okay, so one of the things about culture, again, I've just taken you back through thinking about your culture. Cultural representations are all around. You know, very often people will say things about what their culture is, but then you can go back and look at the language or the verbiage that's used at the club or on the course, and it's completely in contrast to what the culture is supposed to be. When we walk into clubs, these are the things we look at. We listen to the stories that are told, and these stories are such that they might talk about club legends, or they might talk about stories that demonstrate what the club is all about. So you could have a hero story, you know, where you talk about how one time someone went above and beyond and did something really wonderful for a customer. Or you might have a story about how everything is wrong, they couldn't get something they needed, they don't have the tools and resources to do their job. Those are two different kinds of stories, and it gives you insight into culture. Another thing that we listen, like I said, we listen to the language that's used. So example, you know, from a culture standpoint, there's a difference between the word free and complimentary. They mean the same thing, but the way it's presented as part of the culture is different. And if you think about some of these companies, I'll use Starbucks as an example because you're probably familiar with them. They even go so far as to use their own vernacular. They've taught us that a small is a tall, a medium is a grande, and a large is a venti. So these are all part of the culture, part of the brand identity. The other thing that we look at is how do decisions get made? What's the decision-making process? If there's a lot of red tape, and I'm talking now from a pure service standpoint, the most effective service is where an employee can make a decision and handle something at the point of the customer relationship. So if an employee isn't empowered to do something right then and there, that decision-making process is telling about service culture. It might tell you that there's a culture of untrust. It might tell you there's a culture of lack of teamwork, bad communication possibly. But all of these things tell you about your culture. The same thing with your daily work practices, symbols around what's important to the club. But certainly what you say, what you do, what you reward should all be in line for your service culture to remain strong. So the third thing here is responsibility and accountability. Once you've identified your living values, you've trained your staff, and you've defined your culture, the next step is managing it through accountability and clear expectations of responsibility. I view this step very much like coaching a sports team. And that's why I have Coach John Wooden as one of my quotes on here. But on a sports team, every player knows what they should be doing at any given time based on the position they hold and what's happening either on the field, on the court. But the coach is the one who teaches them whose job is it, where they're supposed to be, and when. What do you do if someone steps out of the line? So this quote here I love so much because it talks about discipline, and I believe that discipline is what holds a team together. It certainly holds a service culture in line with where you developed it, where you designed it to be. But if you think about this, discipline of others isn't punishment. You discipline to help, to improve, and to correct or prevent, not to punish, humiliate, or retaliate. And I think this is so important when you're talking service culture, because new managers especially have a very hard time with daily coaching or correcting, holding people accountable. But, if I had to talk about the top things that I get calls about, it's usually consistency and accountability. And the next would be communication. But holding people accountable is so critical to what you do every day as part of leadership at a club. Because if you see someone step out of the lines, step out of the standard that you've set, and you do nothing about it, you've actually just giving a nonverbal approval for that new behavior. So some people I talk to, and it's so easy to do. You're tired, you're working long hours, someone doesn't come in on time, or they do something in contrast to what they've been told. And it's real easy to not deal with it that day. But if you don't deal with it that day, what you've actually done is you've possibly set a new line of standards. And this is how service culture starts to disintegrate before your eyes. This is how everyone drops down a level. And many of you may be at that level, or maybe you walked into a job that's your club is at that level and you're looking to bring it back up. So the way to bring it back up is to put the best team together that you can. Look to develop the strengths of your players. I call this the coach approach. Have group and individual accountability standards. I use daily coaching as part of management, obviously, and using discipline to hold the team together, and discipline in the way that you're helping, improving, correcting, or preventing. Not to humiliate, retaliate, or punish. I love that quote, and I think everyone should share it with new managers. So if you find, or you have someone on your team that's managing in those last three ways, the punishment, humiliation, or retaliation, I would encourage you to take another look at how effective this is in terms of motivating your team and keeping your team high performing. It usually has the complete opposite effect. The fourth part here is learning from failure. Also, like a coach, I believe there are lessons to be learned in failure. And one of the easiest ways to know if you're succeeding or failing at your efforts is to listen to feedback. When you listen to your employee or customers, do you hear lack of trust? Do you hear frustration? Do you hear negativity? I have words up here on the screen. Does it give you pain? Do you feel stagnant? Those are all things you have a physical reaction when you hear this sort of feedback. But I think that feedback is the one that allows you to continuously improve. If you look at these questions, if you get this sort of feedback, these are the questions I would ask. How can I change this perception? Because even if it's not a reality in your mind, if this is the feedback you're getting, it is the reality of your customers or your employees, because it's their perception. And as you know, perception is reality, and it's an important thing to realize, especially in our business, because we are every day battling perception and managing perception. The next question is asking yourself, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? If you hear the feedback and you do nothing with it, I would say shame on you, because that's an opportunity to improve. But if you are part of the solution, you will take that information in and you'll say, thank you, that's great feedback. I'm going to use this to make my team better. The next thing is, who is my weak link? I want to just tell you a very quick story, because this actually happened to me when I worked for Trim Golf. I went to the General Managers Conference, and I had just presented something about training. And Mr. Garmany, Dana Garmany, I'm sure you all are aware, stood up and he gave a very motivational speech. It was very inspiring, and he challenged all of us in the room to go and look at our team and look at our weak link, because he said, as a group, as a company, all of us in that room together, we're only as good as our weakest link. And it really hit home with me. And the minute he said it, I knew exactly who my weak link was. And that weak link was someone that I was constantly managing relationships around. I was constantly managing that person. I was constantly I was working harder on that person than they were working on themselves. That's really the bottom line. So when I went back, I dealt with my weak link, even if it was painful for me, which was my last question here. What am I going to do about it? So I decided, sitting in that meeting, that as painful as it would be, because I actually liked that person very much as a person, and I felt like they had a lot of potential. But if someone's not developing their potential with your guidance, and they're not getting there with you, at some point you have to make a decision if that person is still worthy of being on your team. Sometimes, and what happened with this particular person, she was in the wrong position, and we had a long conversation about it. She decided to leave. She went on to have a great career in a different industry, and it was perfect for her. So sometimes, either because we need the person, or we've put a lot of time and effort into them, we hang on to them far longer than probably they need to be there or want to be there. And certainly it can hurt your team, and it keeps your service culture from being what you want it to be. So when you think about failure overall, if you think about what to do, I think failure helps us to pinpoint weak spots. It identifies communication breakdowns or processes that don't serve the customer. And if you embrace all feedback as a gift and learn from any failure, you have the opportunity to continuously improve. There's no doubt about it. Now, as much as I like to learn from failure, more than anything, I like to succeed. And celebrating success is number 5, and it's so important when you think about your club's culture. If you are not recognizing people when they do something right, if you are not celebrating the hero stories or rewarding people when you catch them doing something right, eventually those behaviors will cease. If you've ever walked into a new facility where everything is exactly how it was meant to be, a lot of thought and care has been put into everything, from the signage to the uniforms to the furniture to the golf carts to the sidewalks, the trimming, everything is exactly perfect. It's real easy to have a strong service culture. What happens over the years, and as each new person comes in, things start to change, and eventually everything that was such a focus at the very beginning starts sort of falling off. But what happens if you aren't noticing when people are doing what you ask them to do, and you're not appreciating them and you're not rewarding them, eventually they stop doing it, because in their minds they start thinking, if you aren't noticing, why am I doing it? And this is when you have a real service breakdown. The cream of the crop at this point, if the success isn't being celebrated, or they're not being recognized for their hard work, or doing something right, or doing what they were told, what happens is the cream of the crop, the ones that you really wanted to be there, they will say, well, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere else where I feel like I'm part of the team, where I feel appreciated. It's a basic human instinct that we feel appreciated and recognized. The people who don't really care, which might not be the people that you want to be employees, will stay, and that's when your service culture starts to move down on the standards line. But I would encourage you as managers, it's important to balance out the efforts that you take to correct things and manage with also recognizing when people do it right. Now, I've been told over the years, people will say, well, why should I recognize them for doing their job? And I could give you 1,000 reasons, but one of them is because you're managing a multi-generational workforce. And some of those demographic groups need more feedback than others. Some of them expect more feedback than others. And certainly, like I said, it's just a basic human need to feel appreciated and recognized for what you've done. But we're so trained as managers to manage, we sometimes forget that there are all those other great things happening, and we need to look for those as well. But it's really something you train yourself to do. One of the things, when you're thinking about all of these 5 areas, I want to just tell you something about the hiring piece again that I think I forgot. And I want to tell you about that Zappos.com. It's one of the companies I mentioned earlier, because the cultural fit is so important when you're trying to build a service culture. You could have great training. You can have a dynamic and engaged team. You can have great service standards, but if you actually just have a bad hire that doesn't fit your culture, it will be very hard to indoctrinate them into your culture. So at Zappos.com, one of the things one of the things they do as part of their interviewing process, they do a cultural fit interview, and that weighs 50% of the decision whether or not to hire them. They also have 10 core values that are instilled in every team member, and there's portions of their budget every year dedicated to team building and culture promotion. So all of these things that we've been talking about, I would encourage you to think about them as an ongoing journey. This is something really important as part of your service experience, because if you don't have a culture behind it, what will happen is someone will say something out of line. You might have something on your website that's out of line with your culture. Somebody answering the phone could turn someone off, and you may lose them immediately. You might spend tens of thousands of dollars on marketing and bring a new customer in, and if they have a bad experience because of your service culture, they won't come back. And I think that's just that's a hard way to lose some marketing money, because if you can't deliver what you're selling through your service, you certainly run the risk of losing not only those new customers you brought in, but also your existing customers that you have. I see a few questions piling up on me over here. So let me wrap this up so I can get to the questions. I want to give you a few final thoughts. Companies that have an adaptive culture, which is aligned to their business goals, routinely outperform their competitors. If you study this and you look at some of the reports that are written, the performance difference is about 200%. What does that mean? That means that if you have a service culture that is strong and everyone knows their role, everyone knows what's expected of them, everyone knows how to do their job, you are increasing your performance standards by 200%. I think that's huge when you start moving that over into actual dollars made or expenses saved. But to achieve these results, you have to figure out what you want your culture to be, and then you have to communicate it. And you have to communicate it like you do a marketing plan. You know, we put out anywhere from 8 to 12, maybe 16 messages through marketing to make sure we reach our customers. You have to do something similar with employees. So be sure that your team is on the purpose of the club and their role within it. And if you have multiple clubs, as an example, we worked with a private owner that has several clubs throughout the Carolinas. They have a brand culture as well. So not only does the club have a brand identity and its own service culture, but you look at a multi-course ownership operation, those clubs too have to have a certain service culture if you're trying to build a brand. So the same thing would go for a golf management company or any management company. You have certain standards that you sell, certain standards, so that when a customer comes to one of your clubs, they know what they can expect. This is service culture. It's hard to It's hard to identify, but it's when you start thinking about it and you start going back to your operations and look at what's happening, I think it gives you a better grasp of what service culture is. But it's really what people are saying, how they're acting, the words that they use, all of that. So in order to move everyone towards the culture you want, you have to get employee engagement and buy-in. And this is especially important if you are, if you joined us today looking for how do I change my service culture. That's probably the very first thing, is to get employee engagement. It also requires an environment of trust and a complete team commitment to embrace the company culture at every level. If you know right now that you have someone that is not going to embrace or is not embracing your culture, if you can't get them there, it's going to be very, very hard for you to have the kind of culture we're talking about. You know, those companies I mentioned earlier, every single employee has bought into that vision and operates from that standpoint. When you're communicating your culture, when you're dealing with adult learners and adult employees, I think it's real important that you figure out what's in it for them, what's in it for the employees. Once you figure that out, that's how you get employee buy-in. You help them to see how this is going to benefit them. And I'll tell you, if you have a group of people that doesn't engage in healthy debate or conflict every now and then, and I mean healthy and respectful, there's probably a lack of trust. And if you have lack of trust, it's real hard to have your service culture, because you end up with silos. You have different departments who are acting in their own different ways. And I very often get calls from clubs saying, we want our food and beverage operation to be as good as our golf operation, or we want our golf operation to be as good as our golf course maintenance operation. Those are silos, and those are three possible different service cultures going on. So when you think about culture, it evolves and changes over time. You know, like I said, there's a difference between a brand new club or a startup club, or someone coming into a new, purchasing a new club and trying to change the culture. As every employee leaves the company and replacements are hired, the company culture can change. And it'll change drastically if you don't hire for values. I will tell you that much. And if you have a strong culture, it might not change much with every new employee coming in. That's the idea, that the culture remains regardless of who's working at the club or the course. But since each new employee brings their own values and practices to the group, the culture will change, at least a little. So as managers, it's important to be prepared to indoctrinate your new hires into your culture quickly. As the environment in which your club operates changes, such as laws, regulations, business climate, wage mandates, anything like that, if those change, your culture runs the risk of changing. So these may be positive or negative, and as managers or owners, you certainly have some influence over what the changes will be to your culture. The changes in the company culture may be intended, but very often they're unintended, because we might lose sight of how important culture is. And like I said, that all goes back to that dynamic and engaged leadership. So I would just remind you, as part of this, go back to that quote. Let me see if I can. No, I'm not even going to try to go back to it. Think about those 1,000 things you do 1,000 times a day, and I would ask you to look at what that means at your particular club or your course or your courses. What does that mean? To me, it means things like, how do you answer the phone? How are guests greeted when you open the car door, when you get their bags, if you give them a bag tag? What does the locker room look like if you have one? How is the driving range set up? What are the standards for that? What are the standards for on-course food and beverage or inside the clubhouse? What are your cleanliness standards? How do you deliver food and beverage? How do you resolve conflict? How do you handle service recovery opportunities? What are your standards around signage? And then how do you communicate, and how does the team operate together? These are all part of the cultural representations at the club or within your company. And if you live the values, you have the power to build the culture. But if you go against your culture or you stop managing it, you have the same power to change or mess up your culture. So I would encourage you to go back, revisit these questions. If we had a little bit more time, I would pause and let you answer some of those questions for yourself. But I would encourage you to go back and answer those questions. Be real honest with yourself and think about, where's my culture today? Where do I want it to be? And then look at what's missing in order for you to get there using those 5 steps. Let me, I'm going to move over here to my questions and see what we have. Okay. So here's something about multi-generational workforce, millennials, Gen X, boomers who learn and need to be celebrated in different ways. Any tips for how you train or celebrate those individuals efficiently and effectively while adhering to your company's standard culture of excellence? Yes, and if I could bottle it, I would probably be rich. I just actually read about Generation Z, which is going to be a whole other generation. So when you think about managing a multi-generational workforce, what I would tell you is it's important to understand that everyone filters in information differently, and everyone has what I call a different tree of influence that factors in how that information flows down. You know, the baby boomer generation believes in chain of command. They respect authority, you know, work hard, do your job. Everyone does their job, and that's how we get it done. Generation X was brought up a little bit differently. They were probably the generation with the first dual income families. So they were latchkey kids. So they had to fend for themselves a little bit earlier than the millennials, certainly. And then they went on to have children, and they decided to do it differently. And so we have now millennials and Generation Z. What I do know about the millennials, and I would just ask everybody to think about this because I get questions about millennials all the time. They live differently. They've had access to the internet nearly their entire lives. It is proven that their phones are a bit of an addiction. So I think it's just important, just like you try to understand your customer so that you can serve their needs and you can look for ways to make them feel special and welcome and comfortable, all of those things that you want for a customer. You really have to look for those same things with your employees, because the way that you treat the employees, and I'm going to borrow this from Mr. Marriott, J.W. Marriott was famous for saying this, if you take care of your customers, if you take care of their employees, they will take care of your customers. So I think it's important, regardless of the generational group, it's important to understand that they're all adults, and when you're dealing with adult workers or adult learners, you have to do it a little bit differently, but certainly understand where they're coming from, how they're filtering in information. But I will say, definitely for millennials, it's been my experience, and every study tells us this, they want constant feedback. Even if they're doing their job perfectly, they want to know that. If they've moved outside of the lines just a little bit, they want to know that as well. But I think they are very open to feedback, but they haven't always received it in the past, but they're very open to getting it because they're just not quite sure. A lot of them did not start out working at a very young age like many generations before them. So sometimes this might be their first job or just their second or third job, and they're still learning. So when you're celebrating them, I think it's important. They need a little bit more ongoing and daily feedback than others. I don't see any other questions here, unless, Ronnie, if you see anything, please let me know. But I would like to just thank everyone for coming. Thank you for joining me. I hope it was helpful to you. I know I went through a lot of information quickly. But like I said, the next topic we have is about creating your service blueprint, which I think that's next month. And just to give you an idea, that basically it shows you how to take a customer decision and break it down into all the systems, procedures, processes, and training that you'll need to make that happen. So I thank you all for your time today. I know it's valuable, and I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you, Whitney, for your time and those great insights as well. Before we sign off, we'll check one more time to see if there are any questions. If there are no more questions, I'd like to remind you that we'll be providing access to this webinar recording and all presentation slides soon afterwards. We will also post this webinar on our NGCOA members-only networking site, Accelerate. While there, I encourage you to check out the archive of exclusive NGCOA webinars and other educational materials. And as Whitney alluded to, and we mentioned earlier, this is the first of a 4-part series, so I encourage you to make plans to attend 3 Steps to Create Your Service Blueprint, which is scheduled for 2 p.m. Eastern on July 11th. So go ahead and mark that on your calendars and make plans to participate. Doesn't look like there are any more questions, so I'd like to once again thank Whitney for your time and each of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us as well. Until the next webinar, take care.